This is a presentation on the ethical considerations of avoiding group harms in the conduction of research with human subjects. This presentation was created for Nursing 706, Health Policy and Advocacy at Anderson University by Amaris Ross in November 2018. Research on human subjects is thought to be fundamentally ethically challenging, requiring ethics standards to guide researchers as well as approval and oversight of research proposals from independent committees. Society allows researchers to invite individuals to participate in research once certain conditions are met, including a research ethics board's review to determine that risks and benefits are appropriately balanced, and that the proposed strategy for subject recruitment is fair, voluntary, and that informed consent is sought from each potential subject. The concept of vulnerability, which finds its origins in the United States Belmont Report of 1979, plays a central role in research ethics thinking. It draws attention to situations where these conditions may not be met. And since 1979, the number of legal and non-legal research ethics policies and guidelines has increased tremendously, and with them, the use and scope of the concept of vulnerability or vulnerable populations. However, there's a lot of scholarly disagreement over the appropriate meaning and application of this concept in research ethics, and policymakers are charged with the challenge of developing and refining research guidelines and policies. In some cases, when individuals who belong to vulnerable populations are involved in research, harm may come not necessarily to the individual subjects, but to the group as a whole, including those who did not actually take part in the research. Most formal policies and regulations on the protection of human research subjects include this risk as an adjunct to the principles of beneficence, which means minimizing risk of harm, and justice, which means equitable selection of subjects, and attribute group harms to the misuse and misinterpretation of research findings. Minimizing group harms is an important consideration in the conduct of research. The dangers of not considering this issue before conducting research are 1, that actual and irremediable harm may come to the larger group or community, and 2, that members of the group may refuse to take part in valuable and useful research in the future. So what is meant by groups? Researchers use the term populations, groups, and communities in a variety of ways. People belong to groups or subgroups because they share some common feature or characteristic of birth, behavior, or belief. Examples include ethnic or racial groups, religious groups. People may belong to groups described by geopolitical location or by occupation, and even behavior. Groups or populations often contain subgroups, and individual people usually belong to many groups and subgroups. Additionally, people may choose to describe themselves as members of groups, or others may assign membership to them. And what is meant by harms? A harm is an adverse outcome that may be physical, psychological, socioeconomic, or political. Although it is not possible to conduct research that is totally risk-free, researchers agree that they must minimize risks or harms to the greatest extent possible. Some groups, because of their vulnerable position in society, may be at especially high risk of suffering harm if individual members take part in research. Generally, these groups include those who have suffered and continue to suffer discrimination, have less access to education, social services, and healthcare, and are socially stigmatized, such as commercial sex workers, injection drug users, or members of religious cults. Group harms result when group members, including those who did not participate in the research itself, suffer negative consequences due to the research findings. Harms that can result from research findings include the following: economic, political, social, educational, genetic determinism, and cultural. Each of these harms may result in emotional distress among group members who did not take part in the research. And some of these harms, especially social, psychological, and political, may be difficult to predict, measure, and remediate. This makes it even more important that researchers pay attention to the possibility that harms may occur. Although some studies have resulted in harms to groups were designed poorly, even well-designed studies can have unintended consequences for members of specific groups that could have been avoided. The following examples have had negative impacts on groups of people who are not necessarily study subjects. The publication of results of research conducted in the Ashkenazi Jewish families contributed to the unvalidated assumption that Jews are more prone to genetic defects and diseases. There was concern in the Ashkenazi community that this information would lead to health and life insurance discrimination, even for those who did not undergo genetic testing. Additionally, there were dignitary harms to the Yanomami of South America, which resulted from ethnographic and genetic research conducted using inadequate informed consent. Then there was the publication of the results from a study purporting to show high rates of alcoholism among Alaska Native residents of Barrow, Alaska, that had unexpected negative economic impacts on all of their residents because it resulted in a negative economic rating for city-issued bonds that made it more difficult for the city to borrow money. There was a number of studies purporting to study the intelligence of African Americans versus whites and Asians that resulted in characterizations of African Americans as less educable. And then there were relations between the Chilean and U.S. governments that were strained after the Chilean press uncovered a politically sensitive study of the processes of social change and counterinsurgency conducted by the U.S. Army. Conducted in Chile, the U.S. government canceled the project after the Chilean government filed a complaint. So what steps can researchers take to minimize these risks of group harm? They can first ask questions like, what are the possible harms that could result from my research? Is it possible that there will be harms to the groups of which my research participants are members? Are there any possible unintended consequences of my research, such as stigmatization or discrimination? If I were a member of this group, how would I feel about the research findings being made public? Do the potential benefits of my research outweigh the potential harms to the participants and to the population? And can I predict how others could use the results of my research findings? Additional steps researchers can take to minimize risks of group harm include community consultations. This is where researchers can work with the community of interest to make sure that the group has an opportunity to identify harms the researcher may not have considered. They can also have collaborative IRB and ethics reviews. This is where their own ethical review board could process the research, and researchers who are working with these groups should apply to the local ethics review body for review and approval of their research. They could also conduct ongoing community consultations. Researchers should work with the group to make sure that they provide group leaders with accurate information about the research as it progresses and changes. The group must have an opportunity to monitor the research and its effects. Researchers should anticipate that their research might have to change or even stop in order to minimize potential group harms. They could also disclose results of research to the community first. Most group harms result from inappropriate disclosure of research results, and researchers should work with the group to develop a plan for disclosing the research results and to anticipate what the implications of disclosure may be. And lastly, they can make benefits result available to the group. This is where researchers must consider how their studies could benefit the communities involved both during the study period and thereafter. And in this sense, benefits should not be merely considered material gains, such as goods and services, but they should include building human capacity and social capital within the community. So let's put these concepts together with the following case study. Dr. Singh has residual blood samples and clinical data from prior research he conducted 5 years ago on the prevalence of thyroid disease in Tibet. He now proposes to use the samples to explore possible genetic risk factors for Cushing-Beck disease, a chronic bone disease that mainly affects children. Given the prevalence of this disease in the Tibetan population, Dr. Singh believes that the subjects would be agreeable to the use of their specimens and data for his research. However, due to the passage of time, Dr. Singh is concerned that he will not be able to locate the subjects to describe the new research and ask their consent. Dr. Singh has approached you as the IRB chair for guidance. So, what guidance might the IRB chair provide to Dr. Singh about obtaining informed consent? Well, the IRB chair might explain that the people of the Tibet have been subjected to political, cultural, and religious persecution. This revelation of a genetic basis for Caution-Beck disease could then lead to further stigmatization and discrimination. The benefits of the research would, at best, be delayed until further research could be done to identify any possible cures or treatments. She also might note that consulting with the community in advance and adhering to the local ethics review process would be consistent with the ethical principle, respect for persons, and inform whether or not the research should proceed and how. Lastly, the IRB chair explains that one might argue that the research is eligible for a waiver of the consent process on the basis that obtaining consent is impractical and the rights and welfare of the individual subjects would not be jeopardized if appropriate steps were taken to protect the confidentiality of their information and specimens. However, she may note that taking such an approach without consulting with the community and having a local ethics review would be insensitive to the community at large and could lead to a situation of group harm in a population that has already suffered. So in conclusion, it's essential that researchers evaluate whether or not their research could result in potential group harms, and if this is a possibility, take appropriate steps to minimize the risk. There's also a continuing need for policymakers to revisit the guidance on the vulnerability in research ethics.